The gunshot-like sound of the exploding tire shattered the silence of the storm, sending billionaire Robert Sterling's $300,000 Bentley careening toward the guardrail at 70 miles per hour. In that split second, as he fought to control the wheel with rain hammering his windshield like bullets, Robert realized that all his wealth, all his power, all his connections meant absolutely nothing if he couldn't survive the next 10 seconds. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. The world slowed to a crawl as physics took over. The Bentley's rear end swung out wildly, the luxury vehicle transforming from a symbol of success into a 2-ton projectile sliding sideways across the rain-slicked asphalt. Robert's knuckles went bone white as he gripped the steering wheel, his heart hammering so hard he could hear it over the screaming wind and the horrible grinding sound of metal against pavement. Through the rain-distorted windshield, he could see the steep embankment rushing toward him, a 40-foot drop into a rocky ravine that had claimed the lives of 3 motorists in the past decade. The local newspaper clippings flashed through his mind, stories he'd barely glanced at while reading the financial section. Now those tragic headlines felt like a preview of his own obituary. Billionaire dies in storm crash, leaves behind business empire and unanswered questions. Time stretched like taffy as Robert fought against momentum and gravity. The anti-lock brakes engaged with a violent stuttering that he could feel through his entire body. The car's advanced stability control systems, worth more than most people's annual salaries, worked frantically to keep the vehicle from tumbling end over end into the abyss. The Bentley came to rest just 3 feet from the edge of disaster, its front bumper hanging over the embankment like a diver frozen at the edge of a high cliff. Steam rose from the hood in ghostly wisps, mixing with the relentless rain that continued to assault the luxury vehicle with percussive fury. Robert sat paralyzed for a full minute, his expensive suit soaked with cold sweat, his breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. When he finally found the courage to look over his shoulder through the rear window, he could see the twisted trail of rubber and metal debris scattered across 50 yards of highway. The blown tire had disintegrated completely, leaving nothing but the bare rim grinding against asphalt. If he'd been driving anything less substantial than a Bentley, if the road had been any more slippery, if he'd been going even 5 miles per hour faster, Robert Sterling would have become just another cautionary tale about driving too fast in dangerous weather. But as the adrenaline subsided and reality crashed back down around him, a new kind of panic set in. He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, desperately hoping for even 1 bar of signal. But the screen showed nothing but the dreaded no service message. The storm had knocked out the cell towers, leaving him as isolated as if he'd crashed on the dark side of the moon. Robert stepped out into the torrential downpour, his Italian leather shoes, custom-made by a craftsman in Milan who had a 6-month waiting list, immediately soaking through as he surveyed the damage. The rain felt like ice needles against his skin, soaking through his $1,000 shirt in seconds. He'd dressed for a boardroom, not a natural disaster, and Mother Nature was making him pay for that hubris. The front right tire was completely destroyed, strips of rubber scattered across the road like the remnants of his perfectly planned day. What remained looked like abstract art created by someone with a very dark sense of humor. The rim had gouged deep scratches in the asphalt, creating a groove that would mark this spot long after Robert had moved on with his life, if he managed to move on at all. This wasn't just any meeting he was missing. Henderson Industries had been courting 3 different buyers for months, and Robert's company, Sterling Global, was in a heated bidding war with 2 other conglomerates that had deeper pockets and longer histories in the industry. The difference between arriving on time and being late could literally be the difference between closing the deal that would cement his legacy or watching his biggest rival swoop in and steal the prize he'd been pursuing for over a year. The Henderson Industries merger represented more than just money, though the $2.3 billion figure was staggering even by Robert's standards. This deal would transform Sterling Global from a successful regional logistics company into a multinational powerhouse that could compete with the industry giants who had dismissed Robert as an upstart for the past decade. But the stakes went deeper than market dominance or profit margins. This merger was personal in ways that Robert rarely admitted, even to himself. His father, William Sterling, had built a modest trucking company from nothing, working 18-hour days and sleeping in the cab of his rig to save money on hotels. William had dreamed of creating something bigger, something that would last beyond his lifetime and provide security for generations of the Sterling family. When William died of a heart attack at 58, that dream seemed to die with him. Robert had been fresh out of business school, full of theories and ambitions, but lacking the practical experience to run a company that employed 300 people and their families. The board of directors, led by his father's former partner, had made it clear they considered Robert a liability, a spoiled rich kid who would run the family business into the ground within 5 years. That had been 20 years ago. Since then, Robert had proven them wrong in every measurable way. Sterling Global now employed over 15,000 people across 4 countries. The company's fleet included everything from delivery trucks to cargo ships, and their logistics software was used by Fortune 500 companies around the world. Robert had built something that would have made his father proud. But the old guard executives who dominated the industry still saw him as an outsider, a nouveau riche interloper who had bought his way to success rather than earning it through decades of grinding, incremental growth. The Henderson merger would change that perception forever. It would place Sterling Global in the same league as companies that had been household names for over a century. More importantly, it would validate every sacrifice Robert had made over the past 2 decades. The missed family gatherings, the abandoned relationships, the 70-hour work weeks that had cost him 2 marriages and left him isolated in a penthouse apartment filled with expensive things, but empty of meaningful human connection. If he closed this deal, all of that would have been worth it. If he didn't, Robert tried not to think about the alternative. Henderson Industries would still be sold, just not to him. His primary rival, Morrison Logistics, had been circling the deal like a shark sensing blood in the water. James Morrison, the company's CEO, was everything Robert wasn't. Old money, Ivy League connections, and network of relationships built over generations of family business. Morrison had made it clear in industry publications that he viewed Robert as a pretender who had gotten lucky during the dot-com boom and would eventually be exposed as the fraud he really was. The thought of Morrison closing the Henderson deal, of reading about it in the Wall Street Journal while knowing he'd been defeated by something as mundane as a blown tire, made Robert's stomach churn. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about proving that merit still mattered, that someone who had built their success through innovation and hard work could still compete against inherited privilege and old boy networks. Standing in the rain beside his crippled Bentley, watching precious minutes tick away on his Rolex Submariner, another symbol of success that felt meaningless in his current predicament. Robert felt the weight of 2 decades of ambition threatening to crush him. He'd already invested $40 million in preliminary negotiations, legal fees, and due diligence. His entire board of directors was counting on him to deliver this deal. The pension funds of thousands of employees hung in the balance. But beyond the financial implications, Robert knew that failure would mean something even worse. It would mean accepting that his critics had been right all along, that he was just a lucky amateur playing in a league where he didn't belong, that his father's dream of building something lasting and meaningful would die with him, buried under the weight of his own hubris and ambition. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here was a man who owned 17 luxury cars, 3 private jets, and a helicopter, rendered completely helpless by something as simple as a flat tire. All his wealth, all his carefully cultivated resources, all his connections to powerful people who could move mountains with a single phone call. None of it mattered when he was stranded on a deserted highway with no cell service and no way to call for help. Robert opened the trunk of his Bentley and stared at the spare tire and jack, tools that might as well have been ancient artifacts from a civilization he'd never studied. He'd never changed a tire in his life. Why would he? He had people for that. Mechanics and drivers and assistants whose entire job was to handle the mundane details that might interfere with his focus on bigger, more important things. But as he stood there in the rain, his expensive suit clinging to his body like a soggy shroud, Robert realized that all his people, all his support systems, all his carefully constructed barriers between himself and the ordinary problems that plagued ordinary people, had abandoned him when he needed them most. For the first time since his father's death, Robert Sterling was truly alone, forced to confront his own limitations without the comfort of knowing that someone else would handle the messy details. The sound came first, laughter, bright and carefree, cutting through the storm like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Robert looked up from his contemplation of the spare tire, squinting through the rain-distorted world around him. At first, he thought he might be hallucinating, that the stress and adrenaline had finally pushed his mind over the edge into wishful thinking. But as the sound grew closer, Robert could make out 3 figures approaching on bicycles. Their voices raised in animated conversation that seemed completely incongruous with the brutal weather surrounding them. They rode with the casual confidence of people who had spent countless hours navigating these roads, their movements fluid and coordinated despite the treacherous conditions. As they drew closer, Robert could see they were teenagers, probably no more than 16 or 17 years old, wearing an eclectic collection of rain gear that looked like it had been assembled from thrift stores and hand-me-downs. The tallest of the 3, a lanky boy with a shock of red hair escaping from under a baseball cap that had seen better years, wore a rain jacket that was at least 2 sizes too large for his frame. His companions, a stocky African-American boy in a bright yellow poncho and a slight Asian boy wearing what appeared to be a makeshift rain cape constructed from a garbage bag and duct tape, flanked him like wingmen in an aerial formation. Robert's first instinct was wariness, a product of 20 years spent in boardrooms where trust was a luxury and paranoia was often the difference between success and failure. 3 teenagers on a deserted road in the middle of the storm, approaching a stranded luxury car worth more than most people earned in 5 years. In Robert's world of calculated risks and worst-case scenarios, this was usually the beginning of a cautionary tale that ended with police reports and insurance claims. But something in their expressions, visible even through the rain and gloom, made Robert reconsider his initial assessment. These weren't the calculating looks of predators sizing up prey. They were the open, concerned faces of people who had stumbled across someone in trouble and felt compelled to help. It was an expression Robert hadn't seen directed at him in years. Genuine care from strangers who had no agenda beyond basic human decency. "Hey there, mister," the redhead called out as they pulled up alongside the Bentley, his voice carrying the easy confidence of youth. "Looks like you could use some help." Robert hesitated, years of corporate paranoia warring with the desperate reality of his situation. He glanced at his watch, 38 minutes until the Henderson meeting, and felt his carefully constructed world crumbling around the edges. "I've got a blown tire," he called back, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. "But I'm not sure there's much you kids can do about it." The redhead grinned and dismounted from his bike with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since before he could walk. "Are you kidding? We've fixed more flat tires than you can count. Mostly on bikes, but the principle's the same." He gestured to his companions, who were already parking their bikes and approaching the car with the unhurried confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing. "I'm Danny, by the way. This is Jake," he indicated the boy in the yellow poncho, "and that's Sam." The slight boy in the garbage bag cape nodded cheerfully, seemingly unbothered by his unconventional rain gear. What happened next challenged every assumption Robert had built up over 4 decades of life in the corporate world. Without being asked, without any discussion of payment or compensation, without even pausing to consider whether they might be putting themselves at risk by helping a stranger, the 3 boys immediately went to work. Danny took charge with the natural authority of someone accustomed to leading, his movements efficient and purposeful despite his youth. "Jake, grab the jack from the trunk. Sam, you're on lug nuts. I'll handle the heavy lifting." The coordination was seamless, like watching a pit crew that had performed this routine hundreds of times before. "You don't mind getting dirty?" Robert asked, incredulous as he watched these kids kneel down in the mud and rain without a second thought, their clothes already soaked through and stained with road grime. "It's just rain," Sam replied with a shrug that spoke volumes about the difference between his world and Robert's. "We're already soaked anyway. Might as well make it count for something." As Robert watched them work, something inside him began to shift in ways he didn't fully understand. In his experience, people only helped others when they expected something in return, a favor, a connection, a business opportunity that might pay dividends down the road. His entire professional life was built on transactions, explicit or implicit, where every gesture of goodwill came with strings attached and expectations that would eventually need to be met. But these boys were helping him for the sheer sake of helping, without any apparent agenda beyond the simple recognition that a fellow human being was in trouble. They worked with the kind of cheerful efficiency that Robert associated with his best employees, but without any of the underlying tension that came from performance reviews and bonus structures and the constant pressure to justify their value to the organization. Jake, who appeared to be the mechanical genius of the group despite his age, examined the destroyed tire with the serious expression of a forensic investigator. "Looks like you hit something sharp," he announced, holding up a twisted piece of metal that had apparently been embedded in the tire. "Probably a piece of debris from the construction on Highway 9. We've seen this before." "You've seen this before?" Robert asked, genuinely curious despite his mounting anxiety about the time. "Oh yeah," Danny replied, not looking up from his work loosening the lug nuts. "We ride these roads all the time, and with all the construction projects around here, there's always junk on the pavement. Last month, we helped 3 different people with flat tires. Week before that, we pulled a tree branch out of someone's windshield after that big storm." Sam nodded enthusiastically, his face bright with the memory. "Remember that lady with the minivan full of kids? She was so worried about being late to pick up her daughter from soccer practice, but we got her back on the road in 15 minutes. As they continued working and chatting, Robert found himself drawn into their easy camaraderie. These weren't the calculating teenagers he remembered from his own youth. Kids who were constantly angling for advantage or looking for ways to monetize every interaction. These were young people who seemed to genuinely enjoy helping others, who found satisfaction in solving problems and making people's lives a little bit easier. "So what's got you out in this weather?" Jake asked as he positioned the jack under the car's frame. "Must be pretty important to risk driving in a storm like this." Robert almost launched into his standard explanation about business meetings and corporate mergers, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the casual way Jake had asked the question, without any of the social positioning that usually accompanied such inquiries in Robert's world. Maybe it was the realization that these boys wouldn't be impressed by talk of billion-dollar deals and corporate acquisitions. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that, in this moment, his professional identity mattered less than his basic humanity. "I have a meeting," he said simply. "An important one. I'm supposed to be there in 35 minutes. "Well, we'll get you there," Danny said with the quiet confidence of someone making a promise he intended to keep. "Won't take us more than 20 minutes to get you back on the road." And incredibly, impossibly, they were right. What Robert witnessed over the next 18 minutes was nothing short of miraculous. Not because of any supernatural intervention, but because of the simple power of competence, teamwork, and genuine care applied to a problem that seemed insurmountable. The 3 boys worked with a coordination that would have impressed a professional pit crew, their movements choreographed by experience and guided by an intuitive understanding of each other's strengths. Danny proved to be a natural leader, his instructions clear and encouraging without being bossy or condescending. Jake demonstrated mechanical skills that many professional technicians would have envied, his hands moving with the confidence of someone who had spent countless hours fixing things that other people would have simply thrown away. Sam, despite his slight build and improvised rain gear, showed surprising strength and an almost uncanny ability to anticipate what his friends would need before they asked for it. But what struck Robert most profoundly was their attitude. They approached the task with genuine enthusiasm, as if changing a tire on a stormy night was exactly how they had hoped to spend their evening. They joked with each other, shared stories about their experiences helping other stranded motorists, and treated the whole situation like an adventure rather than an inconvenience. "You know what the funny thing is?" Danny said as he guided the spare tire into position. "Most people think teenagers are nothing but trouble, but we've probably helped more stranded drivers than the local tow truck service. That's because the tow truck charges $80 just to show up," Jake added with a grin. "We do it for the thrill of the hunt. And because it feels good to help people," Sam chimed in, his voice carrying a sincerity that made Robert's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. As they worked, Robert found himself studying their faces, trying to understand what had created such genuine goodness in 3 young people. In his experience, teenagers were either sullen and resentful or aggressively ambitious, already calculating the angles that would give them advantages over their peers. But Danny, Jake, and Sam seemed to operate from a completely different set of principles, ones that valued community and kindness over individual advancement. "There we go," Danny announced as he tightened the final lug nut. "Good as new." The other boys stepped back, grinning with the satisfaction of a job well done. The spare tire wasn't as elegant as the original, but it was properly mounted and securely fastened. More importantly, it would get Robert to his meeting and beyond, transforming his desperate situation back into a manageable inconvenience. Robert stared at his car, then at the boys, struggling to process what had just happened. In less than 20 minutes, 3 teenagers with nothing but basic tools and generous hearts had solved a problem that had seemed insurmountable. They had restored his mobility, salvaged his meeting, and quite possibly saved his entire business deal. "You really did it," he said, his voice filled with genuine amazement. "I can't believe you actually did it." But even as he expressed his gratitude, Robert's corporate instincts were kicking in. In his world, every service had a price, every favor created an obligation, and every act of apparent kindness concealed expectations that would eventually need to be met. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a thick stack of $100 bills that he always carried for situations that required immediate cash payments. "Here, take this," he said, offering the money with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems with financial gestures. "You've earned every penny." But Danny held up his hands and shook his head with the kind of gentle firmness that brooked no argument. "No thanks, mister. We don't need anything. We were just glad we could help." Jake and Sam nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting the same quiet dignity that had characterized their work. "Besides," Jake added with a practical wisdom that belied his age, "you've got somewhere important to be, right? You should get going." Robert stood there in the rain, holding a stack of money that represented more cash than these boys had probably ever seen at one time, completely baffled by their refusal. He wasn't used to people turning down payment, especially not teenagers who clearly came from modest backgrounds and could undoubtedly use the extra money for things that mattered to them. "Are you sure?" he pressed, his voice carrying a note of desperation that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with his need to make sense of what had just happened. "It's the least I can do. You just saved my life here." "We're sure," Sam said with a smile that radiated the kind of contentment that Robert had been chasing his entire adult life without ever quite achieving. "Just drive safe, okay? These roads get tricky when they're wet." And with that simple admonition, the 3 boys climbed back on their bikes and began pedaling away into the storm, their laughter echoing behind them as they disappeared into the rain-soaked darkness. Robert stood there for a long moment, watching their bicycle lights fade into the distance, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, something that went beyond gratitude or relief, or even simple human connection. It was wonder, pure, uncomplicated wonder at the realization that goodness still existed in the world, that people could still act from motives that had nothing to do with personal gain or strategic advantage. These boys had helped him not because they expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. They had reminded him of a world where kindness existed for its own sake, where people could be genuinely good without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. As Robert climbed back into his now functional car, he glanced at the dashboard clock and felt a surge of relief. 28 minutes to get to the Henderson meeting, tight, but manageable if he drove with focus and determination. But as he pulled back onto the highway, accelerating carefully on the rain-slicked asphalt, his mind wasn't focused on merger agreements or profit projections or corporate strategies. Instead, he found himself thinking about 3 boys on bicycles who had restored his faith in human nature when he needed it most. They had given him something more valuable than transportation, more precious than a business deal, more lasting than money. They had given him a glimpse of the person he used to be, before cynicism and ambition had calcified around his heart like armor that protected him from the world, while simultaneously isolating him from everything that made life worth living. Robert made it to the Henderson Industries meeting with exactly 4 minutes to spare, but the man who walked into that gleaming conference room was fundamentally different from the one who had left his penthouse apartment that morning. On the surface, nothing had changed. He was still wearing the same expensive suit, still carrying the same leather briefcase, still projecting the same aura of controlled confidence that had served him well in countless negotiations over the past 2 decades. But inside, something profound had shifted. As Robert took his seat at the mahogany conference table surrounded by lawyers, executives, and financial analysts, Part of his mind kept drifting back to 3 boys in the rain who had helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. The meeting proceeded exactly as Robert had planned. His presentation was flawless, each slide building inexorably toward the conclusion that Sterling Global was not just the best choice for acquiring Henderson Industries, but the only choice that made strategic sense. He fielded questions with his trademark precision, countered objections with carefully researched data, and navigated the complex web of financial projections and regulatory requirements with the skill of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Charles Henderson, the company's 73-year-old founder, listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was deciding the fate of the business empire he had built from nothing over 5 decades. The other potential buyers had made their presentations earlier in the week, but Robert could see in Henderson's eyes that Sterling Global's proposal had hit the mark in ways that the competition had missed. "Mr. Sterling," Henderson said during a brief break in the proceedings, "I have to admit, your vision for integrating our operations is remarkably sophisticated. You've clearly thought through the challenges that the other bidders glossed over or ignored entirely." Robert nodded, accepting the compliment with a measured grace that had been drilled into him by years of high-stakes negotiations. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. We believe that successful mergers require more than just financial resources. They require a deep understanding of corporate culture and the commitment to preserving what makes each organization valuable, while creating synergies that benefit everyone involved." But even as he spoke the words that would help close the deal, Robert found himself thinking about synergies of a different kind. The effortless coordination he had witnessed among 3 teenagers who had never attended business school or read management theory, but who understood collaboration in ways that most executives never would. When the meeting resumed, Robert delivered his closing arguments with the kind of passionate conviction that had built his reputation in the industry. He spoke about Sterling Global's commitment to innovation, their track record of successful acquisitions, and their plans for expanding Henderson Industries' reach into new markets and demographics. But underneath his professional presentation, Robert was grappling with questions that had never occurred to him before that evening. What was the point of building a business empire if it isolated you from the kind of genuine human connection he had experienced with Danny, Jake, and Sam? What did it mean to be successful if success required you to view every interaction through the lens of potential profit or strategic advantage? The negotiation continued for another 3 hours, with teams of lawyers working through contractual details while Robert and Henderson hammered out the final terms of the deal. When they finally shook hands on an agreement that would make Sterling Global the largest logistics company in the Western Hemisphere, the room erupted in the kind of controlled celebration that characterized high-level business transactions. Champagne was poured, congratulations were exchanged, and arrangements were made for the press conference that would announce the merger to the financial world. Robert accepted the accolades with the gracious professionalism that was expected of him, but the victory felt strangely hollow. Yes, he had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish. Yes, his company's stock price would soar in the morning. Yes, he had secured his place among the business elite and proven his critics wrong in the most definitive way possible. But as Robert sat in his office later that evening, staring out at the city lights through rain-streaked windows, he couldn't shake the feeling that the most important thing that had happened to him that day had nothing to do with billion-dollar mergers or corporate acquisitions. The most important thing had been 18 minutes spent watching 3 teenagers demonstrate what it looked like to help someone without expecting anything in return. Over the next week, Robert found himself obsessing over the encounter in ways that surprised and unsettled him. He had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to focus on business objectives without being distracted by personal emotions or random encounters. But Danny, Jake, and Sam had somehow bypassed all his psychological defenses, leaving him with questions that demanded answers and a restlessness that interfered with his usual routines. He began researching the area where he had been stranded, using the resources at his disposal to piece together information about the small town of Millfield, where his rescuers likely called home. What he discovered both impressed and troubled him in equal measure. Millfield was a community of approximately 8,000 people, situated in a valley that had once been the heart of the region's manufacturing economy. For decades, the town had thrived on the strength of 3 major employers: a textile mill, a furniture factory, and an automotive parts plant. Families had raised generations in the same neighborhoods. Children had grown up expecting to follow their parents into steady, well-paying jobs, and the community had maintained the kind of social cohesion that was increasingly rare in modern America. But economic forces beyond the town's control had gradually eroded that stability. The textile mill had relocated to Mexico in the early 1990s, taking with it nearly 2,000 jobs and the economic foundation that had supported countless local businesses. The furniture factory had held on until 2008, when the financial crisis had forced its closure and eliminated another 1,500 positions. The automotive parts plant had managed to survive until just 3 years ago, when automation and foreign competition had finally made it unsustainable. The statistics painted a picture of a community in decline. Unemployment rates nearly double the national average, median household incomes that had stagnated for over a decade, and a steady exodus of young people who saw no future in staying home after graduation. Main Street was dotted with empty storefronts. The high school had been forced to cut programs due to budget constraints, and the local hospital had closed its maternity ward because there weren't enough births to justify keeping it open. But the more Robert learned about Millfield, the more he realized that statistics didn't tell the whole story. This was still a community where neighbors looked out for each other, where volunteer fire departments and church groups filled the gaps left by reduced government services, and where teenagers on bicycles stopped in storms to help stranded strangers. The economic foundation might have eroded, but something more fundamental, a sense of shared responsibility and mutual care, had endured. Robert discovered that Danny, Jake, and Sam weren't unique in their willingness to help others. They were products of a community that still believed in collective action, in solving problems together rather than expecting someone else to handle the difficult work. It was a way of life that Robert had lost touch with years ago, buried under the pressures and compromises of building a business empire in an increasingly competitive world. The more he thought about it, the more Robert realized that his encounter with the three boys had been more than just a fortunate rescue. It had been a glimpse into a different way of living, one that prioritized relationships over transactions and measured success by the impact you had on other people's lives rather than the size of your bank account or the scope of your corporate influence. 3 days after closing the Henderson deal, Robert made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of celebrating with the usual round of industry conferences and strategic planning sessions, instead of leveraging his enhanced market position to pursue additional acquisitions, he decided to drive back to Millfield. He told himself it was just to thank the boys properly, to make sure they understood how much their help had meant to him. But deep down, Robert knew he was lying to himself. He wasn't going back to Millfield to close a loop or fulfill an obligation. He was going back because he needed to understand what had created such genuine goodness in three young people, and because he suspected that understanding might be the key to recovering parts of himself that he had lost along the way to becoming successful. The drive to Millfield took Robert through countryside that he had never really noticed during his previous trips through the region. He found himself slowing down to appreciate details that would normally have been irrelevant to his purposes. The way morning mist clung to the valleys, the careful maintenance of century-old farmhouses, the hand-painted signs advertising local businesses that had somehow managed to survive in an economy that seemed designed to eliminate everything small and personal. When he finally reached Millfield's Main Street, Robert was struck by the town's dignified shabbiness. This wasn't the kind of picturesque rural poverty that attracted tourists and inspired coffee table books. This was a working community that had been hit hard by forces beyond its control, but had refused to surrender its essential character. The storefronts might be faded, and some of the buildings might need paint, but there were still flowers in the window boxes and American flags hanging from the lampposts. Finding Danny, Jake, and Sam turned out to be easier than Robert had expected. In a town the size of Millfield, 3 teenagers who had helped a stranded motorist during the previous week's storm were minor celebrities. The owner of the diner on Main Street, a cheerful woman named Betty who seemed to know everyone in town, pointed Robert toward the community center where the boys spent most of their after-school hours. "Those boys are something special," Betty told him as she refilled his coffee cup. "Always helping people, always looking out for the younger kids. Their parents raised them right, that's for sure." As Robert walked the 3 blocks from the diner to the community center, he found himself paying attention to details that would have been invisible to him just a week earlier. The way elderly residents waved to him from their front porches, the careful maintenance of public spaces despite obvious budget constraints, the evidence everywhere of a community that took pride in itself despite the economic challenges it faced. The Millfield Community Center was a testament to both the town's economic struggles and its enduring community spirit. The building, constructed sometime in the 1970s during more prosperous times, showed its age in every peeling paint chip, cracked window, and patched section of roof. The parking lot was more potholes than asphalt, and the playground equipment looked like it belonged in a museum of safety hazards from previous decades. But as Robert approached the entrance, he could hear something that made him pause. Laughter. Genuine, unforced, joyful laughter echoing from inside the building, mixed with the sounds of children playing and teenagers engaged in animated conversation. Through the windows, he could see dozens of young people engaged in various activities, some playing basketball on a court where the lines were more tape than paint, others hunched over homework at tables that had clearly seen decades of use, still others working on art projects with supplies that looked like they had been donated by families cleaning out their closets. And there, in the middle of it all, were Danny, Jake, and Sam, leading a group of elementary school children in what appeared to be an impromptu science experiment involving baking soda, vinegar, and an impressive amount of enthusiasm. The boys looked up as Robert entered, their faces lighting up with recognition and surprise. "Hey, it's the tire guy," Jake called out, causing several heads to turn in Robert's direction. "What are you doing here?" Danny asked, approaching with the same open friendliness he had shown on the stormy road, but with a hint of curiosity that suggested he was genuinely puzzled by Robert's appearance. Robert smiled, feeling oddly nervous in a way that boardroom negotiations had never made him feel. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. You really saved my life out there." "It was nothing," Sam insisted, echoing the modesty they had shown the previous week. "Just glad we could help." But as Robert looked around the community center, seeing the worn equipment and obvious signs of deferred maintenance everywhere, an idea began to form. Not the calculated kind of strategic thinking that had built his business empire, but something more instinctive and emotionally driven. "Actually," he said, "I was hoping there might be something I could do for you. For all of you." The boys exchanged glances, and Robert could see wariness creeping into their expressions. They had probably encountered well-meaning adults before who had made promises they didn't keep, or whose idea of help came with strings attached that made the assistance more burden than blessing. "We don't need anything, mister," Danny said carefully. "We're doing fine." "I can see that," Robert replied, gesturing around the room. "But this place, it could use some work, couldn't it?" Before the boys could answer, a woman in her 50s approached them. She had the tired but determined look of someone who had been fighting uphill battle for a long time, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her clothes bearing the subtle stains that came from working with children all day. Despite her obvious exhaustion, her eyes held the kind of warmth that spoke of genuine care for the young people under her supervision. "I'm Linda Harrison," she said, extending her hand to Robert. "I'm the director here. Are you a parent of one of our kids?" "Not exactly," Robert replied, shaking her hand and noting the calluses that spoke of hands-on work rather than administrative oversight. "These three helped me out of jam last week, and I wanted to see if there was anything I could do to return the favor." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly, the protective instincts of someone who had dealt with plenty of empty promises from people who drove expensive cars and wore expensive suits. Robert recognized the look. It was the same skepticism he had faced from countless business partners who had assumed his youth and relative newcomer status in the industry meant he was all talk and no substance. "What kind of favor?" Linda asked, her tone polite but cautious. Robert looked around the room again, taking in details he had missed during his initial survey. The basketball hoops were bent from years of use, their nets long since deteriorated to frayed remnants. The computers in what appeared to be a small technology area were ancient machines that probably struggled to run modern software. The art supplies consisted mostly of dried-out markers and construction paper that had faded from exposure to sunlight streaming through windows that needed new weather stripping. But beyond the obvious signs of financial strain, Robert could see something else, evidence of incredible creativity and determination. The walls were covered with artwork created by young people who had found ways to make beautiful things despite limited resources. A bulletin board displayed academic achievements and college acceptance letters from teenagers who had overcome significant obstacles to pursue higher education. Photo collages showed community service projects where local young people had volunteered their time to help elderly residents, clean up local parks, and assist with food drives for families facing economic hardship. This was where kids came to be safe, to learn, to grow, to become the kind of young people who would stop in a storm to help a stranger. This was where community happened, where values were passed down, where the next generation learned what it meant to care about something bigger than themselves. And it was slowly falling apart due to budget cuts and the economic challenges that had hit Millfield like a slow-motion natural disaster. The kind that might make a real difference, Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. Linda studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to assess whether this was another well-intentioned visitor who would make grandiose promises and then disappear, or someone who might actually follow through on his commitments. Robert could see the moment when her skepticism began to give way to cautious hope. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. Robert had built his fortune by thinking quickly, by identifying opportunities and acting on them before his competitors could recognize what was happening. But this was different. This wasn't about market advantage or strategic positioning. This was about using his resources to preserve something precious and irreplaceable. "Tell me what this place needs," he said. "Not just the obvious repairs, but what it would take to make it everything it could be." Linda's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. That's a big question," she finally managed. "I'm prepared for a big answer," Robert replied. Over the next 2 hours, Robert listened as Linda, Danny, Jake, Sam, and several other young people painted a picture of what the Millfield Community Center could become with adequate resources. The wish list was both heartbreaking and inspiring. A new roof that wouldn't leak during every storm, updated electrical systems that could handle modern technology, computers that could actually connect to the internet reliably, art supplies that would allow young people to explore their creativity without having to make do with scraps and leftovers. But their dreams went beyond basic infrastructure. They talked about expanded after-school programs that could keep kids engaged and learning during the crucial hours between school dismissal and their parents' return from work. They described mentorship programs that could connect local young people with adults who could help them navigate the challenges of growing up in a community with limited economic opportunities. They envisioned job training programs that could give teenagers practical skills while also teaching them the value of hard work and personal responsibility. As Robert listened, he began to understand that this wasn't just about fixing a building. This was about investing in the future of an entire community, about ensuring that young people like Danny, Jake, and Sam had the resources they needed to develop their potential and maybe, someday, find ways to revitalize their hometown. "How much would all of this cost?" Robert asked when Linda had finished describing their vision. Linda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with putting a price tag on dreams that had seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. "I don't know," she admitted. "We've never really allowed ourselves to think that comprehensively about it. Maybe $500,000. That would cover the major repairs and give us a foundation to build on." Robert did quick mental calculations. $500,000 was less than he had spent on his last vacation, less than the bonus he had given himself for closing the Henderson deal, certainly less than the appreciation on his investment portfolio in any given month. It was, in the context of his personal wealth, essentially a rounding error. But in the context of Millfield, $500,000 would be transformative. It would mean the difference between a community center that barely functioned and one that could serve as a beacon of hope for generations of young people. It would mean the difference between talented kids like Danny, Jake, and Sam having limited opportunities and having the resources they needed to reach their full potential. "What if we made it $1 million?" Robert asked quietly. The room fell silent. Linda stared at him with an expression that cycled through disbelief, hope, and the kind of cautious excitement that comes from daring to believe that something impossible might actually be possible. "Are you serious?" she whispered. "Completely serious," Robert replied. "But I have one condition." The wariness returned to Linda's eyes, and Robert could see Danny, Jake, and Sam tensing slightly. In their experience, conditions usually meant that help came with strings attached that made it more complicated than it initially appeared. "I want to be involved," Robert continued. Not as a check-writing donor who disappears after the photo opportunity, but as someone who actually helps with the work. I want to understand what you're building here, and I want to be part of making it happen. Linda looked at the boys, then back at Robert, her expression shifting from caution to something approaching wonder. You want to volunteer? I want to do more than volunteer, Robert said. I want to learn from you. From all of you. You've shown me something I've forgotten I was missing. And I think maybe helping you build something meaningful might help me remember who I used to be before I got so focused on building my business that I lost track of everything else. What happened next became the stuff of Millfield legend, talked about in the diner and the barbershop and the church social halls for years to come. Robert Sterling didn't just write a check and disappear back to his corporate world. He threw the full weight of Sterling Global's resources behind transforming the community center. But more importantly, he threw himself into the project with a kind of personal commitment that nobody had expected from a billionaire businessman. Within a month, construction crews had descended on the building like a benevolent army. But these weren't just any construction workers. Robert had handpicked teams of craftsmen who specialized in historic renovation. People who understood that the goal wasn't just to create something new, but to restore something precious while making it better than it had ever been. The leaking roof was completely replaced, but not with generic materials. Robert insisted on installing a state-of-the-art system that included solar panels, energy-efficient insulation, and a design that would make the building a model of environmental sustainability. The cracked foundation was not merely patched, but completely reinforced with techniques that would ensure the building could withstand whatever challenges the next century might bring. But Robert didn't stop with basic infrastructure. The old gymnasium was expanded and equipped with professional-grade basketball hoops, volleyball nets, and exercise equipment that would have been appropriate for a college athletic program. The computer lab was outfitted with cutting-edge machines and high-speed internet that made the center's technology capabilities better than many schools in the region. The art room became a true creative space, stocked with supplies that allowed young people to explore everything from traditional painting and sculpture to digital design and video production. A new music room was constructed from scratch, soundproofed, and equipped with instruments that had been donated by professional musicians who learned about the project through Robert's network of contacts. Throughout the renovation process, Danny, Jake, and Sam were there every day after school, not as observers but as active participants in the construction. The crews, initially skeptical about having teenagers underfoot, quickly came to appreciate the boys' enthusiasm, work ethic, and surprising competence with tools and techniques they had learned through years of fixing things that other people might have thrown away. But more importantly, the boys were teaching Robert things he had never learned in business school or boardrooms. They showed him how to measure twice and cut once, how to take pride in work that was done properly regardless of who might notice, how to find satisfaction in building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. Danny taught him about leadership that came from genuine care rather than authority or position. Jake showed him how to solve problems through creativity and persistence rather than just throwing money at them until they went away. Sam demonstrated the quiet dignity that came from helping others without expecting recognition or reward. As the weeks passed, Robert found himself spending more and more time in Millfield, not just supervising the construction, but becoming part of the community in ways he had never experienced as an adult. He rented a modest apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, telling himself it was just temporary, just until the project was finished. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself again. For the first time in decades, Robert was somewhere he actually wanted to be, surrounded by people who valued him for what he contributed rather than what he owned. He began eating breakfast at Betty's Diner every morning, sitting at the counter and listening to the conversations of farmers and shopkeepers and retired teachers who had lived their entire lives in Millfield. He learned about the town's history, its struggles, its small victories, and its hopes for the future. More importantly, he learned about the individual stories of resilience and community that made Millfield more than just another struggling small town. There was Martha Henderson, the librarian who had spent her own money to keep the library stocked with new books when municipal budget couldn't cover it. There was Bill Kowalski, the retired mechanic who fixed cars for families who couldn't afford to pay, accepting payment in the form of homemade meals and help with his garden. There was Dr. Sarah Chun, who had given up a lucrative practice in the city to provide medical care for people who might otherwise have to drive 2 hours to see a physician. These weren't people who had achieved conventional success in terms of wealth or fame or professional recognition, but they were people who had built lives of meaning and connection, who measured their accomplishments by the impact they had on their neighbors and their community, rather than by the size of their bank accounts or the scope of their influence. The grand reopening of the Millfield Community Center drew visitors from across 3 counties, including state representatives, education officials, and journalists who had heard about the remarkable transformation of a struggling small-town facility into a state-of-the-art community hub. Local news crews covered the event, marveling at the gleaming new building that somehow managed to honor its humble origins while embracing a future full of possibilities. But for Robert, the real victory wasn't the media attention or the accolades from government officials or the professional recognition from business publications that praised his commitment to corporate social responsibility. The real victory was watching Danny, Jake, and Sam cut the ribbon on the new playground, their faces glowing with pride and excitement that was absolutely contagious to everyone who witnessed it. The playground itself was a work of art, designed with input from children and teenagers who understood better than any adult what would actually be fun and engaging. It featured climbing structures that challenged kids without being dangerous, interactive elements that encouraged cooperation and creativity, and adaptive equipment that made it accessible to children with disabilities. But beyond the playground, the entire center had been transformed into something that exceeded everyone's wildest dreams. The gymnasium gleamed with polished floors and professional lighting. The computer lab hummed with the latest technology. The art studios were equipped with supplies that would have been appropriate for a professional art school. The music room featured instruments that had been donated by musicians who had heard about the project and wanted to contribute to something meaningful. During the dedication ceremony, Linda Harrison took the microphone with tears streaming down her face. 6 months ago, she said, her voice thick with emotion, this building was falling down around our ears. We were patching leaks with buckets and duct tape, hoping the ceiling wouldn't collapse on our kids. We were making do with computers that belonged in a museum and art supplies that were older than some of our teenagers. She paused, looking around at the transformed space and the hundreds of people who had gathered to celebrate. Today, thanks to one man's generosity and 3 boys who showed him what community really means, we have a facility that will serve this town for generations. But more than that, we have proof that people still care about each other, that strangers can become family, and that the simple act of helping someone in trouble can change the world. The applause was thunderous, but Robert barely heard it. He was looking out of the crowd, seeing faces that had become familiar over the months of construction. People who had welcomed him not because of his money, but because he had proven himself willing to work alongside them for something they all cared about. When Linda called him to the front of the room to speak, Robert felt a nervousness that was completely different from anything he had experienced in corporate presentations. This wasn't about convincing anyone to buy something or agree to a business proposition. This was about expressing gratitude for gifts that couldn't be measured in financial terms. 6 months ago, Robert began, his voice surprisingly steady. I was a different person. I thought I knew what success looked like, what mattered, what was worth pursuing. I had built a business empire, accumulated more wealth than I could spend in several lifetimes, and achieved everything I thought I wanted. He paused, looking directly at Danny, Jake, and Sam, who were standing with their families in the front row. But I was missing something fundamental, something that 3 boys on bicycles taught me during the worst storm of my life. They taught me that the most important things in life can't be bought or sold or negotiated. They can only be given freely, from one person to another, with no expectation of return. Robert's voice became stronger as he continued. This community center isn't my gift to Millfield. It's Millfield's gift to me. You've shown me what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself, to care about people you've never met, to invest in a future you might not live to see. You've reminded me that true success isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Danny, Jake, and Sam didn't just help me fix a flat tire. They helped me fix something in myself that I didn't even realize was broken. They showed me what it looks like to help someone without calculating what you might get in return. They reminded me that kindness isn't a business strategy, it's a way of life. When Robert finished speaking, The applause was different from the polite recognition he was used to receiving at corporate events. This was personal, heartfelt, the kind of appreciation that came from people who understood that they had witnessed something genuine and transformational. As the ceremony wound down and families began exploring the new facilities, Robert found himself surrounded by children and teenagers who wanted to show him their favorite features of the renovated building. They dragged him from room to room, pointing out details he had forgotten he had approved, explaining how they planned to use equipment he had helped select, sharing dreams that had been made possible by resources he had provided, but that belonged to all of them now. That evening, when the crowds had dispersed and the local news crews had packed up their equipment, Robert found himself alone with Danny, Jake, and Sam on the steps of the community center. The boys had grown taller over the months of construction, their voices deeper, their shoulders broader, their confidence more mature. But their essential goodness, the quality that had compelled them to help a stranger on a stormy night, remained unchanged. The four of them sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set over Millfield and paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson that Robert had never taken time to notice during his previous life of constant motion and perpetual deadline pressure. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Danny said finally, breaking the peaceful quiet. "What's that?" Robert asked. "We just thought we were fixing a tire," Jake said, grinning. "We had no idea we were changing someone's life." Sam nodded thoughtfully, his expression more serious than his friend's. "Makes you wonder how many other people we pass by every day who could use a little help. Makes you think about all the opportunities we probably miss because we're too busy or too focused on our own stuff to notice when someone needs us." Robert felt tears he didn't expect welling up in his eyes. These boys, barely old enough to drive, had understood something that had taken him 4 decades and a near catastrophe to learn. They had grasped intuitively what he had needed a dramatic life experience to comprehend. That the most meaningful moments in life often came disguised as ordinary encounters. That the opportunity to make a difference was always present for those who had eyes to see it. "You didn't just change my life," Robert said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved it. You reminded me what it means to be human, what it feels like to be part of something bigger than your own ambitions and fears." Danny looked puzzled. "We just helped with a tire, Mr. Sterling. You're the one who did all this." He gestured toward the community center, which glowed warmly in the evening light. "No," Robert replied, shaking his head. "You gave me something much more valuable than I gave you. You showed me that there's still goodness in the world, that people can still act from pure motives, that kindness doesn't have to be strategic or calculated. You reminded me of who I used to be before I forgot that success, without meaning, is just an expensive form of emptiness." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Millfield, Robert realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for his entire adult life, without knowing he was looking for it. It wasn't wealth or power or professional recognition, though he had achieved all of those things. It was connection. It was purpose. It was the simple but profound satisfaction of knowing that his life had made other people's lives better. The Henderson Industries merger had made him richer than he had ever imagined possible, but it had also left him feeling strangely empty, as if he had climbed a mountain only to discover that the view from the top revealed nothing but more mountains to climb. But 3 boys with muddy hands and generous hearts had shown him a different kind of summit, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or market share, but only in the lives touched, the problems solved, the hope restored. 6 months later, Robert made a decision that shocked the business world but surprised no one who had gotten to know him during his time in Millfield. He sold Sterling Global for a figure that made headlines in the financial press, but he used the proceeds in ways that would have baffled his former competitors and colleagues. He established the Millfield Foundation, dedicated to supporting community centers and youth programs in small towns across America that were struggling with the same economic challenges that had hit Millfield. The foundation's mission was simple: to identify communities where young people were making a difference and provide them with the resources they needed to expand their impact. But Robert didn't just write checks and delegate oversight to professional staff. He and Linda Harrison co-founded a program that sent teams of young volunteers to help with disaster relief and community improvement projects, creating a network of teenagers and young adults who understood that helping others wasn't just a nice thing to do. It was a way of life that could transform both the helper and the helped. The program grew beyond anything Robert had initially envisioned. Young people from communities across the country began organizing their own volunteer efforts, inspired by stories of teenagers who had made extraordinary differences through simple acts of kindness. The foundation provided funding, coordination, and recognition, but the real work was being done by thousands of Dannys, Jakes, and Sams who understood instinctively that they had the power to change the world one person at a time. Robert established his permanent residence in Millfield, buying a modest house 2 blocks from the community center and becoming as much a part of the town's fabric as if he had been born there. He served on the school board, coached youth basketball, and spent his evenings tutoring kids who needed extra help with math and science. But his favorite tradition was the annual drive he took every year on the anniversary of that stormy night when his tire had blown out. He would retrace the same route where he had been stranded, not in a Bentley this time, but in a pickup truck loaded with supplies for whatever community project needed attention. Sometimes Danny, Jake, and Sam rode along. Now college students pursuing degrees in engineering, education, and social work, but still committed to the simple principle that had changed all their lives. Sometimes he was joined by other young people who had been inspired by their example. Sometimes he drove alone, using the quiet time to reflect on how dramatically his life had changed since that night, when 3 strangers had appeared out of storm to help him. The flat tire that had almost ruined everything had turned out to be the breakdown that led to his breakthrough. Sometimes, Robert reflected, the universe had to stop you dead in your tracks before it could show you which direction you were really supposed to be going. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the help you needed came from the most unexpected places, wearing rain-soaked clothes and riding rusty bicycles, ready to prove that kindness wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the right moment to change the world. Robert had learned that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or assets or market capitalization. True wealth was measured in relationships built, problems solved, lives improved, hope restored. True wealth was the knowledge that when your time on earth was done, the world would be a little bit better because you had been part of it. And true wealth was the understanding that everyone, from billionaire business executives to teenagers on bicycles, had something valuable to offer, some unique contribution that could make a difference in ways they might never fully comprehend. The key was being open to both giving and receiving help, recognizing that the roles of helper and helped were fluid and interchangeable, and that the most profound changes often began with the smallest acts of kindness. Robert Sterling had started that stormy evening as a man who thought he had everything, but was missing what mattered most. He had ended it as someone who understood that having everything meant nothing if you didn't have people to share it with, people to serve, people who could remind you that success without purpose was just another form of poverty. The story of 3 boys who helped a stranger change a tire had become the story of how a stranger learned to change his life. And it had become proof that in a world that often seemed cynical and divided, there were still people willing to stop in the rain to help someone in need, and that simple act of kindness could create ripples that reached farther than anyone could imagine. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power we all have to change someone's life with simple acts of kindness, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary goodness of ordinary people. Share this story with someone who could use a reminder that there's still hope in this world. And let us know in the comments about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your day, or maybe even your life. Together, we can create a movement of everyday heroes, one story at a time. Because sometimes the smallest gesture, stopping to help with a flat tire, offering a smile to someone who looks lost, or simply taking the time to really see the people around us, can change everything. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss these inspiring stories that prove kindness is still alive and changing the world every single day. See you in the next video.